15 years ago, 60 Minutes visited the small city of Hazleton, Pennsylvania. At the time, the mayor had signed the first-in-the-nation ordinance to fine anyone hiring or housing undocumented immigrants. Recently, 60 Minutes Plus went back to Hazleton, where the Latino population has doubled. And correspondent Enrique Acevedo sat down with the former mayor, who's now running for governor. Take a listen.
I'm guessing you're thinking you're going to win Hazleton in the governor's race, of course.
I hope so.
Lou Barletta is betting his run for governor will be his political comeback. He's also expecting residents will remember him for more than his positions on immigration.
So these were old abandoned warehouses here. This was like the worst section of town.
He led us to some of the projects he said benefited the city's Latino residents, like affordable housing.
So if you had an elderly parent, they can live here with them.
And this soccer field.
And you think we're standing here as proof that you can get that Latino vote?
You know, that's why I won with 90% of the vote when I ran for mayor. You know, why should that be? Shouldn't they have all voted against me?
Lou Barletta's popularity at the polls does not necessarily reflect support from Hispanic voters, since they have historically not turned out to vote here in Hazleton, a trend that continues today.
I don't want to point finger, but I think my friends from the Latino population, that they are registered and ready to vote, they are about 5,000. They had to come out and vote in Hazleton.
For Amilcar Arroyo, it's not just about getting Hazleton's Latino voters to the polls.
Thank you.
It's also about getting Latinos elected. Earlier this year, the 72-year-old entered politics for the first time in his life and ran for Hazleton's school board.
And I think for the Latino, it's time now to go to the next step, which is be elected.
Political representation.
Political representation.
I was surprised, a little bit surprised, that despite that growth that we've been talking about in the Latino population, there's not one elected official, one Latino elected official in Hazleton.
No, but we're getting more candidates now. We're getting people who are now wanting to get politically active and actually doing better. And eventually, people will become politically active.
During the primary election this spring, Arroyo lost his opportunity to get on the November ballot, but Nicarol Soto prevailed. If she lands a spot on Hazleton City Council, she'll be the first Latina to hold elected office in the city.
So it's this young Hispanic Latina against 5 long-life residents in the city of Hazleton.
And do you think you have a chance?
I think I do. I have to keep it positive.
And Enrique joins us now to talk about this. So just describe for us, Enrique, what has changed in Hazleton since former Mayor Lou Barletta left office?
Vlad and Mary, it's great to be with you again. A lot has changed. You were just saying at the beginning of our conversation that Hispanics, Latinos in Hazleton are now the majority of the population, around 60% of Hazleton's entire population. Crime rates have gone down. The economy is doing very well. It has created thousands of jobs in the past 15 years since the last time 60 Minutes was in town. And it's just a fascinating story, right? This small all-American city in Pennsylvania, far away from the border, really became the unlikely epicenter of our immigration divide. And in this past 15 years, we've been able to see all the arguments in favor and against immigration play out, and the town is doing pretty well.
I find this fascinating because I covered this story working out of the CBS station in Philadelphia, and I remember at the time there were concerns that undocumented families were going to be kicked out of their homes and be homeless because landlords were scared, and that children would then be pulled out of school, or people wouldn't seek the health care that they needed because they would be sort of going underground. And there was the support for coming from the KKK and white supremacists, and I remember being there thinking, but this is such a pretty town. It just, what you saw, and then the story we were covering, there was such a clash, if you know what I mean, of images. And so this brings me back to Lou Barletta. He was an early supporter of former President Trump. Do you see similarities in the two men?
Absolutely. Lou Barletta was, if not the first, one of the first members of Congress to support President Trump, then candidate Donald Trump. He says some of his policies on immigration inspired the narrative, the rhetoric we saw coming out of the Trump campaign and then the Trump administration. So there are a lot of similarities. I asked Lou Barletta if now that he's running for governor, he felt comfortable being labeled a Trump Republican. And he said, absolutely, I love the guy, I love his policies, and I think he's the leader of the Republican Party. So there are a lot of similarities. In many ways, Hazleton incubated a lot of what we've come to know as Trumpism, this movement behind President Donald Trump that has grown to a national scale. So yes, I see a lot of similarities between those two characters. And Lou Barletta, he says that sometimes journalists, the media, quote unquote, conflate what he wanted to do with undocumented immigration with being anti-immigrant. But we asked people around town and residents of Hazleton if they felt that this policies, this city ordinance that he put forward divided the city along ethnic and racial lines, and they all agreed. This went well beyond the undocumented population, and it sort of painted everyone with that brush.
So you mentioned a little bit about this, Enrique, but let's just dig down into the numbers. Hazleton's Latino population has doubled in 15 years. Since 60 Minutes was last there, it is now 60% of the community. How has that changed? What are things like now versus how they were 15 years ago?
Right, going down to the specifics. For example, I would ask Enrique Soto, one of the characters in our story that we were seeing on that preview, if speaking Spanish was frowned upon or was difficult back when she moved to Hazleton when she was a teenager. And she said, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't speak Spanish at school because we get bullied. I asked her if she would, she felt more comfortable speaking Spanish now publicly in Hazleton, and she said, absolutely. And there's also, with all these narratives around Hazleton, there's one that I find really interesting, which is this idea that Latinos are not a monolithic community. We sound like a broken record when we say this, but in the case of Hazleton, I mean, this is a Dominican, a majority of Dominican population, right? People coming from the Dominican Republic are about 80 to 90% of all the Latinos living in Hazleton. And that's very different from Cuban Americans or Mexican Americans, Central Americans living in other parts of the country. And it has to do with how they engage in the political process. Dominicans remain very involved in their own, in the politics back home, right, in the island, and not so much here in the States. And you see that in Washington Heights, in New York, where presidential candidates from the Dominican Republic campaign in Washington Heights in New York more than they do in Santo Domingo. So those are all the dynamics behind this fascinating story.
So then is that part of the reason why, even though there's a pretty large Latino population there are no Latinos who hold election or hold a position in office, elected position? Is it a cultural thing, or is there something more? Sometimes there is the echo or the ghost of the past of Hazleton that can kind of come back. So what I'm trying to get at is, are there other things kind of holding them back from pursuing elected office?
Yeah, it's never one thing, right? We always aspire to provide this nuanced reporting that explains not just one cause, but looks at everything that's happening. I think history is certainly important. Vlad was asking about what has changed in Hazleton, but for everything that's changed, the town remains largely segregated. You see that in the neighborhoods. You see that in just the way that life happens every day in town. And so the political process should try to engage more with this Latino population, with the Dominican population. I think that's part of it, educating them on how things work, on getting this message across that local politics is probably the most important thing you'll ever get involved with, in the sense that These elected officials are making decisions on your everyday life, your street, your school, the hospital, etc., jobs in town. So I think that's part of it. Also, the fact that they're more engaged with the political process in the Dominican Republic than they are in Hazleton. And finally, political representation, seeing more candidates that look and speak and understand the issues that are important to them.
Enrique, really interesting. I'm glad that you went back to revisit this cute little town in New Jersey. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You can watch Enrique's full 60 Minutes Plus report right now on Paramount Plus. There, you can also get breaking news and thousands of episodes of your favorite TV shows. Just visit ParamountPlus.com for a free trial.